Hi everybody, welcome back. Welcome, welcome, welcome. So today I want to continue working on the silver piece that we started last week. The initial design we had pierced out in silver plate and began to transfer the design from the paper design to the silver itself. And so I finished cutting out the other leg of the design. And today we're going to talk about and look at the design for the bail. And let me go back to the piece itself. And as you remember, we worked on the first leg of this last week and finished it up. And now what we're going to do is we're going to work in silver again. It's going to be a solid silver piece. But what we're going to be doing today is working on the bail itself and the connecting mechanism between the bail and the piece. So we've got some silver square wire, a few different sizes, and some plate sheet. And what we're going to do is we're going to cut out these two square design elements that also are going to act as the hinge for the bail itself and the pendant. So we're going to be working on these three pieces today, well, four pieces if you count the crossbar that goes inside of the bottom part of the bail, and get those cut out and prepped and get the bail mechanism started and see if we can finish that today. So what I want to do now is show you the wire that we're going to be using. This is just standard silver square wire. It's about 2 millimeters wide, a little over 2 millimeters wide. And we've got a couple of different sizes. And you can use square wire for any number of designs. And it comes in real handy, already made. You can get it, or you can roll it out yourself if you have a rolling mill. And so it makes it very handy once it's in this shape to cut the designs out that we're going to be working on today. So first thing I want to do is I want to take the larger of the wires, and we want to square off the end a little bit. You can see where the side cutters have left a sharp edge on the end. And what we want to do is just take our file and flatten that out and remove that sharp edge. And that's relatively easy to do in silver because, as you know, or maybe you don't, silver is a pretty soft metal and it works pretty easy. So what I've done is I've just squared off the end of that wire, and let's get it a little cleaner. And we want to make it relatively smooth and take any of the big gouges out of it and smooth it off as much as we can. And we're going to make two pieces equal in size, so it'll be as wide as it is thick. And just so we can get some scale here, there's your, it's around 2 millimeters wide. So we want to cut it so that it's about 2 millimeters thick as well, so we have an equal square. And there's a couple of ways you can do that. You can cut it long and then come back and file the piece back, which you probably want to do anyways, as once we mark this in the thickness that we want it to be, you'll be cutting on the opposite side than the design itself, so that you don't end up using the saw and cutting into the line, thus making the part smaller when you're finished. You want it to be a little bit longer than the length that you want it to go to begin with. So what we'll do is we'll set our divider at a little over 2 millimeters, so that when we scribe it, we'll know that we cut on the far side of that line, and our piece will be long enough that we have some material to remove, but not a lot. The less you have to remove after you get the initial design, obviously the less work you have to do to remove that material afterwards. So we'll go ahead and get and this is a number 1 saw blade, which is kind of my go-to saw blade for most just straightforward cutting, because it cuts relatively fast. And so there we cut off the one piece. Now the other side is almost ready, and we could use that as the clean surface, measure off of that distance, and then cut that piece. But it's a little bit rough, so I'm going to go ahead and file off some of that saw blade mark. And then we'll mark that distance again. And then take our saw and cut it off. And if you remember last time when we talked about using the saw frame, and how we approach the metal, and we try to keep it upright so that it doesn't twist the blade, because if you twist the blade side to side, it'll bind up as you're cutting and you'll end up snapping the blade off. So you want to have a light touch, and you want the saw frame kind of to hang from the piece, and then your hand is really just pulling down on the saw frame. You're letting the saw frame kind of walk forward on its own and not twist the saw frame and bind up the blade. So we got those two pieces cut out, and now what we want to do is we want to remove the cut surface on the other side. As you can see, that's kind of rough, sticking up a little bit. It's got a sharp edge on it, and it's not really square. And you can use a pin vise or other holding mechanisms, tools, to hold the piece. So what I'm using is I've got a pair of parallel pliers, and then they have serrated jaws. So it helps when you're holding pieces that are small. It helps kind of hold them securely so you can work on them without them slipping around too much in your hand. So we'll go ahead and use our rough cut file and take off some of this cut surface from the saw blade. Now I'm holding the pliers at an angle so that I can see into the jaws, and I can see that flat surface that I created with the file on the far side. And by turning the pliers so that I can see into the pliers, I can see if my file is canting at an angle or if it's straight on and equal. Because you don't want a file. It's easier to remove metal than it is to put metal back. So what I'm doing is looking through as I'm filing and just taking small passes with the file to remove material. That way, if I start to go off square, start to cant the file at an angle, I'll be able to see it before I get too far and correct for that by tilting the file at a little more extreme angle to get that to go square again. So we removed with the rough cut file the biggest parts that were sticking off. And now I'm just cleaning up the face of that. And that one looks pretty good. So there's still a little bit of flashing on the, or what you could call a burr on the surface of the material, and that can be taken off with a less aggressive file or a sandpaper stick, which is the way I like to do it. It seems to be the easiest way to take off those sharp burrs that come after sawing. Okay, so now we'll go ahead and file the other piece again with our parallel pliers, and go ahead and grab those, grab it, and again using the rough cut, and this is a zero cut Swiss file, which is a cross cut file. And in other words, the teeth go both directions, hence the name cross cut. and it can remove material pretty quickly. And that's one of the reasons you want to have multiple files if you can. It makes it easier when you're having to remove a lot of material to have a rough cut. You don't spend as much time trying to file it away with a smoother cut. Okay, now we'll go to and that looks pretty square. All right. So now if we go back to our pendant, and we can set these in place so you can get an idea of how we're wanting this to go. We're going to have these two squares on either side of the pendant, and then this will be our bail material here that'll go between these two pieces, and the crossbar will go inside where the pendant loops around to hang from. So we can put these aside, and let's look at the bail itself. So this is slightly over twice the length that we want to have. We want it to be about 8 millimeters long when we're done. And right now it's just slightly over 20 millimeters long. So the first thing I want to do is I want to find where the center is on this piece so that we know how far out we want to mark on either side so that we can create what will be the top of the pendant. You can make it in 4 pieces, or in some cases you can make it in 1 piece if you're good at measuring and good at math. I like to make it in 2 pieces at least. That way you can refine your first piece and get it right where you want it to be before you make the final piece that would be soldered in place, thus closing the loop. And so to do that, we're going to use our divider again, and we'll go ahead and find 10 millimeters on the ruler, and this will give us the center of the bail. And then we want the top of the bail width to be slightly wider than our chain is going to be, which is 2 to 2.5 millimeters. So I'm going to make it 3. So what we want to set our divider is at 1.5, and then mark either side of your center line. And I'm sure chat will correct me if I miss that measurement. So I've got it marked out. Now the next thing I want to do is I want to put 2 crossing lines from one side to the other on our 1.5 millimeter marks on either side. And if you have a square, that's the easiest way to do this. You can just use your square and find your line. And make your mark. So what we've got now is we've got two crossing lines and a center mark. What I'm going to do now is I'm going to use the saw frame to start cutting into the line from side to side and creating a channel that we're going to come back and use our files to make a triangle so that we can bend that piece over and have the top of the bale closed in. So go ahead and get this mark started. And as with sawing any silver or gold, you want to take light passes until you get your line started, so that the blade doesn't walk off of the line that you want it to cut. And I'm cutting about a millimeter into the piece, so about half the thickness of the plate. And then I'll come back with the files and we'll start defining that fold joint that we're creating. What we're doing is we're going to if we want to fold the piece and we want it to be square, we're going to come in and basically remove all this material at an angle so that when we bend this side up, it'll be square to the 90 degrees. We'll have a nice square corner to come back and solder in, creating the loop on one side. Then bend the other side up and create the other end, and that'll make the top of the bale. And using needle files is the easiest way to do it. You can come back with a burr and cut that in with a rotary tool, a flex shaft or a rotary tool. But that is very hard to control when you're working on very small pieces, and it's easy to get off track and to lose the line that you're trying to cut if you use a rotary tool and not a hand tool. Now, needle files come in all kinds of shapes, and what we're using right now is a square needle file. And it's just a tapered square, starts thicker on one side and tapers down to a smaller end on the other. And as with most files, you can get different cuts so that you have finer files for doing finishing work and coarser files for removing more material. And what I'm using is I'm just putting it on a small handle so that it's easier to control the file itself while you're removing material. Now, again, you can use pliers, or you can use a pin vise, or you can use your fingers to hold the piece in place as you're passing the file through that slot. And different people use different tools for that. I tend to use my fingers to hold the piece, but you may find that using pliers makes it easier for you. Whatever works easiest for you, but we're going to continue to use the parallel pliers with the serrated jaw, and just for continuity's sake, since we already used it to cut the smaller accent pieces of the bottom part of the bale. Now, because silver is so soft, you want to have something backing it as you're putting force onto the piece. If you don't have something backing it, it'll have a tendency to want to bend at that weak point. And since we cut through with the saw blade and removed some material here, that made this very weak here. So if I were to just try to file it in space like this with nothing backing it, I could bend that really easily. Now, if you only do it once, you'll be okay generally. If you bend it more than once back and forth, you know what happens when you start bending metal back and forth. Eventually it wants to break. So what I'm doing is I'm just laying this on the bench pin so that I've got it backed, and I'm going to take my square file and put it down into the slot I just cut with the saw, and then I'm going to just go ahead and start removing material. And you can see as you go if you're removing equal amounts of metal, or if the file is kind of teeter-tottering back and forth across the joint. And you can see as you draw the file forward if you're removing material both on the front and the back of the piece equally. And sometimes you need to rotate the piece to your eyes so that you can see if you're cutting equally all the way across the face of the piece. So we're going to go ahead and file down to the bottom of that cut that we made with the saw. And you'll know when you get there because the file will kind of bottom out and it will be a little bit more difficult to draw forward because the file has nowhere to go on the bottom. It's now riding across the bottom of the plate at the bottom of the cut that you just made. So we started the first side. We went a little over halfway through, and we're not done, but I want to go ahead and get the other side started so that when we go to finish this first side, we've got most of the material removed and ready to bend. Now, after we make these initial cuts and file slots in the piece, I'm going to come back again with the saw frame, and I'm going to cut just a little bit deeper into that slot so that we can get our file to go down just a little bit deeper. And you want to leave enough metal so that it just holds when you bend the piece up. It just holds together when you bring it up to 90 degrees. and that small tab of metal will remain to hold the piece together. So we'll go ahead and use our square file again and file a little bit deeper. On both sides. Okay. So we've got the piece prepped to be bent. And we used our saw frame to cut out the line that we had scribed on both sides. And then we used our square file to remove a triangular shape through each piece. So now I want to use my non-serrated pliers so that we don't mar the inside of the piece. And before I bend it, I want to clean up the inside surface. Now, depending upon how well you can use the pliers and what the sheet looked like, you may have some surface marring or scratches or even gouges or nicks in the face of this material on the inside. And once this is bent up, it's going to be difficult to get into that area to remove any deep scratches. So I'm just going to use the sandpaper stick with a relatively fine grit. This is about 800 sandpaper, and use this to remove a little bit of material from the inside face of this piece. And as you file, you want to look at the material that you're removing. And the sandpaper are going to leave witness marks along the inside in the direction that you're drawing the piece. Scratch marks, witness marks along the surface. Any deeper cuts are going to stand out until you sand through them. So I like to file in one direction first to see if I have equally removed material on all of the piece, or if there are still any scratches that remain in the other direction. And I can see a few on this far side that are a little bit deeper, and so let's remove a little bit more material. There we go. So now that I've sanded it in one direction, I'm going to sand it in the other. And then once I've removed equal amounts of material in both directions, the sanding marks when we went this way will all be gone. So now we've smoothed that pretty well, and I'm going to use another grit of sandpaper, a finer grit, and this is 1200 sandpaper. And I'm going to do the same thing. I'm going to sand in one direction and then look at the piece and see if the scratches that I made when I sanded it in the other direction are gone. And if they are, I'll know that I've removed equal amounts of material both times. And we'll go to some emery cloth, which is a much finer abrasive, and pre-polish the inside face. of the bale. Now we're going to take the parallel pliers, the non-serrated parallel pliers, and we're going to just slightly bend over the piece. So now we have the first bend, and you can see the joint has come together, and now the metal is contacting all the way across the face of the joint. Now we can come back, grab the other side, and repeat that process until we're almost closed. Now I can close that gap, and now you can see that the bale is bent over equally across the joint, across the face of the joint. And we'll look at the inside opening that we wanted to be a little over 2 millimeters wide, and that will be large enough for the bale or the chain to pass through as the bale hangs off of the chain. Now the legs, as you can see, are still not finished. One is slightly longer than the other, and that's because the overall length of the piece initially was over 20 millimeters, and we used 10 millimeters as the center line. So one leg is at the right length, the other one's slightly longer, and we can leave that for now. When we close the bale by making a piece to bridge that gap from one side to the next, we can use that surface to solder off of, or we can come back and once this is soldered closed, we can file that material away to make it equal in length as the other, and use the bottom piece of the bale to close the gap and solder it that way. It really doesn't matter one way or the other. I like to wait until right before we're ready to close the bale to make sure that the face of the bottom of the bale is flush and square, so that the bottom part of the bale can come up against that without any gaps. But it's up to you how you want to finish that. So that part is prepped and ready for soldering, and we'll put that aside. Now we're going to look at how we're going to make the connection between the bale and the two design elements and the hinge mechanism for the other side. You need to have enough material on the sides so that when you make that connection, that jump from one side to the other. So this is the bottom of the pendant, and this is going to be one of our square elements on the top, and this is going to be our bale. The inside of the bale in its width is a little over 2 millimeters wide, this gap, and these squares are 2 millimeter squares. So the bale is going to be slightly wider than the bottom or the width of these design squares. Then the crossbar that goes between one to the other, that the bale is going to loop around, needs to be from a smaller or needs to have a smaller diameter than the squares that we're putting on the side. So I'm going to use a smaller gauge wire, and I'm going to create basically a little U-shaped piece. And that U-shaped piece is going to go in between these two designs, and it's going to go up through and then back down on the other side. And it'll stand off the top of the pendant just a bit so that you'll be able to see a slight gap between the bottom of the bale and the piece. And that gap is to give you enough room so that your bale can move freely forward and back without getting bound up between the crossbar and the top of the pendant. If you were to make that crossbar too short, and loop it through, your pendant would, or the bale would be so tight against the pendant that you wouldn't really have any movement or freedom of movement between the bale and the pendant itself. And if we were making a solid bale, or we connected the bale directly to the piece, that would be fine. But since we're making the bale free moving, we have to have enough gap between the top of that crossbar and the top of the pendant. So this is kind of, as we lay it out, what I'm talking about. If it's too close, it'll bind up. So we want to have a little bit of space between the top of the pendant and the bale itself. And I'm going to use this smaller gauge square wire. It's a little bit bigger than about half of the size. It's about 1.5 millimeters square wire. And what I'm going to do is I'm going to bend this piece similar to how we did the pendant, in that I'll make a couple of cuts and use the file to square out those cuts. And then I'll come back and bend the piece square and create another U in basically the same layout as the bale itself. And we want it to be tall enough, as I said, so that it doesn't bind up. So the width of this, the top of this loop, is going to have to be wider than the width of this bale itself. And the bale's 2.5 millimeters wide. So we can make a center mark on our material, and it doesn't really matter how far over. I'm going to be removing all of the excess material from the bottom of it anyways. So we're just going to mark a place there and then set our dividers at slightly over 1.5 millimeters, closer to 2. And then, which side did I mark that on? There it is. I mark here, and then equally off the other side. Now you can take your bale and lay it between those marks, and you want to see that they're free, or you've got a little bit of room on either side of those marks. from where your pendant width is. Now I know that my cut is going to be the width of this material, slightly bigger when it's bent. So I want to set my dividers at that width. I want to come off of that outside mark that we just made, both sides. And then what I'm going to do is I'm going to be filing away material between those. So go ahead and take the saw, and we will do the same thing we did on the plate. Go ahead and use the saw to cut a little bit over halfway. Now I'll come back with the square file and begin removing material from the first cut. Down to the bottom of the saw cut. Again, watching the cut marks along the material from both sides so that I know I'm removing an equal amount of material from both sides. And once I have it to the depth that I want, I will all right, so now just to double check, so a margin, they'll always try to leave a margin for error. What I know is that my file is going to cut this metal the width of this. And if I didn't measure and I went ahead and started filing away on the other side, I could remove too much material on this inside edge, and then the gap between the bent arms on either side would be too small and the bail wouldn't fit. And so if I cut past that secondary line and I bent that arm up, it would be too tight and the bail wouldn't fit between the two. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to make an equal mark of the width of this cut to the other side. And what that shows me is that if I want to have that gap be slightly bigger than the width of the bail, I'm going to have to move where my second cut is with the saw before I begin filing away the material. Otherwise, at the end of that, the bars would be too close together. So I did that, and then that. Use. So now we can begin to cut the scribe line, or the pilot, line for the file to follow with the saw frame. And again, we're only cutting slightly deeper than halfway. And then coming back with the file to remove material on either side of the cut. Again, I'm rolling the piece slightly as I'm cutting so that I can see that I'm removing equal amounts of material on the entrance side of the cut as well as on the exit side of the cut. Okay, so just a little bit deeper. And it should be fine. So now that we have the material removed from either side of the joint, just like we did with the bail, I'm going to come back and grab the side with the parallel pliers and then bend this crossbar 90 degrees to that leg. And the reason I'm doing this rather than just bending it with my fingers is that I'm less likely, by using these parallel pliers, to bend the bottom part of this leg as I'm bending this joint closed. By grabbing it with the parallel pliers, I'm holding that leg straight and then bending the top bar over and not risking bending the other parts that I don't want bent. So now that we have that first bend, I'm just going to make a quick measurement of the leg, which is longer than it needs to be, but it's good to have scrap material when you're cutting so that I don't make the piece smaller than I want it to be. And I'm just going to cut off the rest of this material. And then I'm going to use the parallel pliers again on the far side of this leg and bend this crossbar down square. Yep, that's what happens sometimes. So basically the part separated. But since we're going to be welding this anyways, it doesn't stop us from going to the next step, which would be welding these two joints closed. So I wanted it to stay together so that I could show you that when the bail was along this bar, there was a little bit of room on either side for that pendant to move freely, where it's going to hang on the top of the pendant like that. And then we're going to put these square elements on either side of that and weld that to the top of the pendant. But what we've done is we've prepped the joints so that when we go to weld the piece, we'll have a nice square joint. Instead of trying to hold 3 little pieces together for each one, had we not kept them connected, I would have 3 separate parts that I needed to try to connect. This is going to be a whole lot easier to handle and thus solder than this one, and this one's only in 2 pieces, so you can imagine how much more difficult it would be to get everything aligned if there were 3 pieces for each, instead of 2 for this one and 1 for this one. So that's the reason we came and cut these slots, these joints, into the material and bent it, rather than just cutting each piece individually, filing the angles properly, getting them to be the right width as individual pieces. It was a whole lot easier to do as one piece than it would be if we were trying to do them as independent pieces. So there's where we are today, and looks like we've come up on our hour. So I've got the bail and the top of the bail connecting mechanism prepped. I've got the 2 square design elements that are going to go on either side of the jump mechanism, and we've got the bail prepped in preparation for the next step. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to, in the next stream, is I'm going to weld these pieces together, and then cut and file them so that they're ready to be joined to the plate itself. And then we will have our rough pendant prepped for pre-finishing and finishing. So I hope that that you were able to see what we were trying to accomplish by cutting those joints into the plate, as opposed to, like I said, doing each one individually, because it's a whole lot easier to do it as one piece than it is as multiple pieces. And the bail's going to have 4 pieces altogether, so that would have been that much more difficult to try to do individually than it is to do as a single piece. So thanks for joining today. I hope you learned something. Feel free to message me if you have any questions, and I will be happy to get back to you. And we look forward to seeing you on our next stream. Thanks for coming, everybody. Bye.